Here's what's positive, though, for Brock Purdy, for anyone that manages to survive and have Brock Purdy on their team, or, Deebo, who was a little bit disappointing last night as well. Look who's coming up in their schedule next. The Washington Commanders. Now they've got a very angry, pissed off, very motivated 49ers team that just got embarrassed on national TV, and they're going to just take it out on somebody. Who's next? Who do we get? They get the Washington Commanders. I can't wait to see the massacre of my team. This is so sad and depressing.
Love-hate pass catchers. Obviously, that was Matthew at the top, ready for the Niners offense against the Commanders, Matthew, and that's why Deebo Samuel, who's had an interesting week in the news, him and Cam Newton, Deebo Samuel leads the love list for pass catchers.
He does. A lot of people are like, you know what, Barry? You have so many stats about the Commanders and how bad they are this year. Surely you must have run out by now. No way, Monfrey. Absolutely not. I have many other bad stats about the Commanders. They've allowed the second most receptions of 25 yards or more this season. Since week 10, they allow a league-high 44.1 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Exactly. They are the 26th worst pass defense over the last 4 months. In fact, no team has given up more points, just in terms of total points, over the last 4 weeks than my Washington Commanders. Like, you can score against them in many ways. And friend of the podcast, friend of the show, two-time friend of the show, Deebo Samuel, should do that early and often against my Commanders. He's had at least a 27% target share in 4 of the past 5 games as well. Don't forget that Ron Rivera is going to be calling the plays in this one. He doesn't know what he's doing. So anyway, this is going to be, I think this is going to be ugly.
Yeah.
Look, we need to lose this game, Commanders. We need to lose this game. We came close against the Jets of winning. Stop it. We need a top 3 pick. You guys know what to do. You understand the assignment, Ron. Understand their assignment, Washington. Deebo's going to have a big week. He's my wide receiver 6.
Yeah, there is no better hangover cure drink than the Washington Commanders. Some are calling the Washington secondary liquid IV.
Yes.
For Deebo and co. And couldn't ask for a better spot for Brock Purdy to get right. And Deebo should be a big beneficiary.
All right, our next one on the love list here, Nico Collins. Jay, for Matthew, he comes in as wide receiver 8. We know what the Collins-Stroud connection can do, and it's looking like promising news for Stroud returning to practice, and that means good news for Nico Collins.
Yeah, D'Amico Ryan said that C.J. Stroud was in stage 4 of the concussion protocol, and there are only 5 stages, so you would expect that he is likely going to play. Certainly the spread, which is around Texans -5.5 now, so that certainly indicates that Stroud is going to play. And we haven't seen much of Nico Collins with CJ Stroud without Tank Dell, but I think we're going to see that this week most likely, and just he should get a supreme target share against the Tennessee defense that just doesn't have any people left. Like, Jeffrey Simmons is on IR, they're really banged up, obviously traded buyout earlier in the season, so this is a very friendly matchup against a pretty weak secondary, and Nico Collins should feast.
To your point, Jay, they've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. The Titans have as well. And so this game is at home, as we talked about, where C.J. Stroud and Nico Collins have both played very well. In his games at home so far this season, Nico Collins averaging 23 fantasy points per game. Every touchdown he's scored this year has come at NRG Stadium, and that's where they're going to be playing on Sunday as well. So Nico Collins, who is averaging 23 points per game at home, as we talked about, and with C.J. Stroud under center, weeks 1 through 13, all the full games that Nico Collins played with C.J. Stroud under center, he's wide receiver 9 on a points per game basis for the season. He comes in at wide receiver 8 for me this week. I have Nico in a matchup. I'm in the finals in my longest running fantasy league. I'm in a league with all the guys I went to college with. It's a keeper league that we've had for literally over 30 years, and I'm in the finals. I co-own a team with my college roommate. We really enjoy it, and Nico Collins will be starting for the Parrot Heads, which is our team, as you can imagine.
Not too far behind him, Matthew, Chris Olave, who in his return has looked really, really good. And on top of that, he gets a great matchup against the Bucs in Week 17.
Look, since Week 6, Chris Olave has had only one game with fewer than 8 targets. Only one game where he hasn't gotten at least 8 targets. Why does that matter? Because wide receivers that have seen at least 7 targets against the Buccaneers are averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. No team in the NFL has given up more yards to wide receivers. They've also given up the 4th most fantasy points. So Chris Olave should have a huge game. I have a top 10 play against the Buccaneers because, by the way, the Bucs are playing red hot too. I think this game has sneaky shootout potential as well. I know that the Saints usually have a pretty good defense, but I like the over in this game, which I think is at 42.5. The last time I looked, it was 42.5. I like the over in this game, Jay. I think this has sneaky shootout potential. Two offenses that are playing pretty well.
Yep, that over's been trending upwards, and I think just the level that Carr showed. I know they lost the game against the Rams, but Carr looked good and delivered 20-plus fantasy points. Baker Mayfield's been playing like a top 10 quarterback for a month now, so I agree that this one has shootout potential. And I think with Olave, I think a lot of people might have got suckered into the Bucs defense playing really well against the Jags. I think that says more about the Jags and where Trevor Lawrence is at with his body and where that offense is at the moment. Like, there still isn't a good Tampa Bay Bucs defense. Think about what CJ Stroud to them, other teams that have lit them up, Brock Purdy's perfect passer rating. So I think that Olave should be able to do whatever he wants.
Next up here, Matthew, Trey McBride. We know the kind of volume McBride has gotten since he's taken over as the starter. And as you always say, start your tight ends against Philadelphia.
Death taxes and start your tight ends against Philadelphia. Connor, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned the kind of volume. Here's a stat just to underline that. Since he took over as a starter, Trey McBride has the 7th highest target share of any player. Oh, not of any tight end, of any player in the NFL. The 7th highest target share of any player in the NFL. And you mentioned the matchup against the Eagles. Tight ends that have seen at least 6 targets against Philly are averaging 16 fantasy points per game. Trey McBride is a top 3 tight end for me this week. I know it wasn't an awesome game from last week against Chicago, but and I do think, that would change if Kyler Murray were suddenly not able to play in this one, but we expect Kyler Murray, even with the illness, we expect Kyler Murray to go and them to be trailing in this one. So Trey McBride should be peppered early and often. I lost a lot of TJ Hawkinson this week. Luckily, I have Trey McBride in a few leagues. And in a couple of leagues, I most definitely do not have Trey McBride. But if you've ridden Trey McBride, enjoy it. It's a great week for you and him. He makes the love list of tight end 3.
And just quickly, the Eagles now have the number 28 defense in the NFL by EPA per play, and that's trending in the wrong direction. That's getting worse. And last year they had the number 4 defense. So that's been, it's a big story. It's been well covered, but that is just puts in stark terms how badly that defense has fallen.
A couple others receiving votes here. Chris Godwin in that game you just mentioned, Matthew, comes in as wide receiver 20. JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba against the Steelers. Demario Douglas against the Bills. Chig Okonkwo against the Texans, and Gerald Everett against the Broncos. Some maybe viable flex plays or wide receiver 3 plays here, Matthew, and some streaming tight ends.
Godwin's finally looked like Godwin, 3 straight games with a target share above 30%. You mentioned JSN. Steelers, who allowed the 4th most yards to the slot. Demario Douglas, very quietly since week 8, has a 23% target share against Buffalo. You expect the Patriots to have to throw, and that offense throws to him, especially with Hunter Henry banged up. Hey, Chig Okonkwo finally coming around. Since week 12, he's a top 12 fantasy tight end. Houston, great matchup as their bottom 5 in receptions, yards, and fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And Gerald Everett, 23% target share of his last 3 games. It's worth noting the Broncos allow the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So Gerald Everett, I think, is a viable streamer this week as well. Him and Chig Okonkwo if you're missing TJ Hawkinson, for example.
All right, we move over to the hate list for pass catchers, Jay. Headlined by DJ Moore. Got a little banged up in the first quarter last week. Did not finish the game strong. And against Atlanta with A.J. Terrell, we talk about this a lot in fantasy this year. It always gives you a little bit of a scare because he's somebody that can shadow wide receivers. Yeah, absolutely. And look, 1, the concern, as you mentioned, about the injury, so that's a problem. 2, this Atlanta defense, not a great defense, but they do have A.J. Terrell for a number 1 wide receiver. And also, on the season, they are the 15th ranked pass defense. And a lot of that came when their guys were injured. And so now they are healthy. And that is the key thing. And I think that's what really shone against Indianapolis. The fact that they have guys like David Onyemata back. The fact that Jesse Bates is playing like close to the best safety in the NFL this season, plus A.J. Terrell. Nate Landman, they really missed him for a while. So this is all of a sudden a pretty solid defense against a banged-up DJ Moore. Matthew, where does he rank for you?
Yeah, he comes in at wide receiver 27 for me this week. I mean, look, my concern here is, like, he got banged up last week, right? He came back, he gutted it out, but still couldn't get to 20 yards against the Cardinals. And now, as you mentioned, he faces A.J. Terrell and this Falcons defense that since week 9 has allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And in fact, in that stretch, only one wide receiver has even scored more than 13 points against the Falcons. So I'm as a low-end wide receiver 3 because I get it. He's still DJ Moore, but at less than 100% in a tough matchup, it's hard to see him having a monster game here.
Our next one, Matthew, is Calvin Ridley against the Panthers. He comes in as wide receiver 24 for you. This one might be tough because we don't know if Trevor Lawrence is going to play, but I have to ask you, how much of a difference does it make at this point, even if a banged-up Trevor Lawrence is able to gut through this one for Calvin Ridley?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's ideal. Honestly, I still think a less than 100% Trevor Lawrence is better than C.J. Beathard, which is who they would have here. But I agree with Jay's comment from early in the show, which is like it was more about the Buccaneers. It was less about the Bucs defense and more about the ineptitude of the Jaguars offense at the moment than anything else. And so with Lawrence, who's either going to be less than 100% or C.J. Beathard, you're going against a Carolina defense that is top 4 in the NFL in terms of fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. Only 2 wide receivers since week 7 is having even more than 64 receiving yards against these Carolina Panthers. That secondary has really come on well. They're playing well. It's an inconsistent passing attack here. They still haven't really found their rhythm since Christian Kirk went down in Jacksonville. And, of course, Lawrence has been dealing with a myriad of injuries. So I feel like this is a big Travis Etienne game. I feel like they try to lean on the run game as well against Carolina because that's where you attack them. Over the last month, Panthers are the 3rd best pass defense in the NFL. Like they've really, really played well. And what's been a tough year for Carolina, that secondary has been a bright spot.
Jay, our last pass catcher here, George Pickens, comes in as wide receiver 35 for Matthew. He's put on quite a Gabe Davis kind of season here where massive weeks like last week and then weeks where you can't find him.
I think the issue is just he's dependent on these 60, 70-yard touchdown catches, and that's just obviously very unsustainable. And the fact that Mason Rudolph will be the quarterback, I don't think that is great news for George Pickens, who established a rapport with Kenny Pickett. And also just against the Seattle secondary that should get Devin Witherspoon back. I think there are a lot of reasons that George Pickens could trend down.
Yeah, Matthew, could you start him in championship week? I mean, you have to be pretty desperate, right?
Pretty desperate is right. I mean, I'm at wide receiver 35. You mentioned how dependent he is on big plays, touchdowns. 34% of his fantasy points this year have come on his touchdowns, on those deep passes. But over the last 10 games, Seattle top 5 in the NFL in terms of fewest yards allowed on deep passes. They defend the deep ball very, very well. Since week 8, he's had 1 game with more than 4 receptions. I don't expect Mason Rudolph to go into Seattle and surprise the Seahawks the way he did the Bengals. I think the Seahawks will be ready to play. It's always tough to play at Seattle. So again, just wide receiver 35 for me this week.
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBCSports.com and Rotoworld.com. And I want to thank you so much for watching whatever it is you just watched. Or if nothing else, being too lazy to click out of the autoplay after this video started, after whatever it is you actually wanted to watch finished. But now that you're here, I'd like to take a moment here to ask you respectfully now, okay? I'm asking you respectfully to subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel. You'll get the latest Roto-World fantasy news headlines, all sorts of great shows, including my own Fantasy Football Happy Hour. So go subscribe now. Again, I'm asking respectfully.